So next up, we've got Jing, all the way from Singapore. We're really excited to have her speak at this year's Design Systems Week. I'm a long time fan of her blog. You'll find a link in the chat. She has written and given lots of talks about subjects like Flexbox and grid and model layout, images, lots of interesting stuff. Fun fact about her is that she used to be in the Malaysia national basketball team, and that is actually where she learned to build her first website. And she's built many websites since and learned a lot about front-end development. Today she is going to talk about CSS for internationalization. So yeah, I'm really excited to have her here. We don't have her physically here because she's actually traveling and stuff has gone wrong with the planes. So we have got a backup video that we're about to show you.
Hello, beautiful people at Design Systems Week 2024. Today I'm going to be talking to all of you about CSS for internationalization. But before we get into things, I want to discuss this thing called numeronyms. What they are number-based words, where a number is used to form an abbreviation. Now, I18N stands for internationalization because they are 18 letters between I and N. And some of you may have also seen L10N, which is the abbreviation for localization. Now, some of you may be wondering, is there a difference between these two terms? The answer is yes. Now, there's no canonical set-in-stone definition of internationalization, but the W3C does offer this guidance that you see on the screen here. Internationalization is meant to enable easy localization for specific audiences, and localization covers a broad range of customizations, including, but not limited to, numerals, date and time formats, currency symbols, sometimes even icons, colors, graphical references. So, internationalization is actually a lot more than simply translating the content on your site to different languages. There are nuances to the presentation of that content which will affect the experience of a native speaker using your site. And this is where CSS comes in. Now, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now, to me, it is a vocabulary for us to communicate with the browser. The first standard for CSS was published on December 17th, 1996, which makes CSS, if you calculate it in your mind, an almost 28-year-old Sagittarius. Now, fun fact, when CSS first came out, it wasn't even meant for doing layout. Now, let that simmer in your mind for a little bit. But almost 3 decades later, we went from what seemed like trying to communicate with a toddler to having a pretty wide vocabulary for telling the browser how we want stuff on our web pages to look like. Lara Schenk once wrote a great piece about the nature of CSS, concluding that it is a domain-specific declarative programming language, and I really wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, pulling things back to the whole internationalization thing, have you ever browsed a website using a Chromium-based browser that was a different language from your default, and then there is a pop-up on the browser that asks you if you want the page translated? Did you ever wonder how the browser knew to ask you this? Or maybe if I phrase it another way, how come sometimes it doesn't ask you, right? The key here is a little something called a lang attribute. And it plays a very important role because it specifies the natural language of the content of a web page to the browser. And this information is used for a lot of things. Browsers are pretty smart and they come with a lot of sensible defaults. And if the browser knows what language your content is in, it gives you a lot more useful stuff out the box. And we will cover some of the browser's language-specific behaviors, ranging from font selection and CSS properties. But look at this list right here. There's so much good stuff that the lang attribute can give you. The first thing to kind of settle is that you must always set the overall default language on the HTML element. Simply because if you set it lower, like on the body element, then the stuff in the head doesn't get it. And there's important information in the head of the website as well. Language code information is inherited according to the following order of precedence. So first goes a lang attribute on the element itself. If that's not there, then the closest parent with a lang attribute set. If that's not there, then the browser is going to look at the HTTP content language header. And if that's not there, then the browser is just going to default to user agent defaults and user preferences. Now, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this particular pseudoclass, but the lang pseudoclass is a pretty cool selector. So in this example, we have this mixed language sentence that's set up like so. And the bit in Chinese is marked up with a span tag with its language set to ZH, which is Chinese. Now, Chinese language does not have italic styles, and neither do other East Asian languages like Japanese or Korean. In order to emphasize words, Chinese writing uses a type of punctuation called 着重号, and we can use CSS for this with the text emphasis property. So the correct way of presenting this Chinese text is to get rid of that italics, and then optionally we could emphasize it using dot. So text emphasis also has more values available, like double circle or triangle. You could even put a string there if you want to, like, I don't know, do emojis work? Yes, apparently they do. But that's no longer relevant to Chinese typography. Chinese typography just uses the dot. But the point of this example is to show the lang pseudoclass, because it will recognize the language of the content on an element even if the language is declared outside the element in question. So in this case, right, the attribute is on the span tag and not on the M tag, but the browser still knows which element to apply these styles to. Now, lang is like any other HTML attribute. So attribute selectors, in CSS, can be used to identify content with a particular lang value set. But then the difference from the pseudoclass is that this has to be on the element that you actually want to target. Attribute selectors, overall, language aside, pretty versatile because of the number of options it offers for matching. Not exactly regex, but kind of, sort of. And you can match the attribute value exactly, or you can match just the front part of the selector, or you can match anything before a dash, because that's most relevant to language codes, right? So that's also a way to target. Now, a couple of things to note here is that if you choose to use the lang pseudoclass, partial tag matching is already taken care of. For example, if you wanted, because there's the main Chinese language tag ZH, but then there's also kind of like sub-language like ZH Han T, ZH Han S, and so on, that comes after a dash. So if you wanted to match ZH in a document with different extended Chinese language tags, that just works out the box with the pseudoclass. As for the mechanics of matching, the attribute selector operates based on the attribute of the element, while the pseudoclass makes use of the document's semantics. Now, you're always free to use normal classes or IDs, but then you'll have to give those elements very specific language CSS classes or IDs. And again, CSS, very versatile. It's really up to you. Personally, I would go for the pseudoclass route. And there are numerous CSS properties now available to us, which lets fine-tune the presentation of our content, right? From all the way from the font level up to the layout level. So there's going to be a lot of typography-related CSS coming up, just to prepare you. And an example of a font level CSS would be the property that deals with faux fonts, or like fake fonts. Because when you use a typeface that does not include styles for bold or italics, the browser is going to try to artificially create these typefaces by modifying the glyphs on the typeface. And for designers in the audience, numerous designers have told me that the end results are not very aesthetically pleasing, and I do have to agree with them. That looks a little off, And in the case of Chinese, it's actually not even necessary. Like the example I used before, like italics just don't need to happen, you know what I mean? So there is a font property called font synthesis that can be used to fix issues like this. So just tell the browser, stop it, don't synthesize anything. Just say font synthesize none. I've used the pseudoclass here again, fixes these unnecessary like synthesized fonts, so to speak. Now the lang attribute will also impact default font selection by the browser. So again, I'm going to use Chinese because that's really my native language, but Chinese fonts are, in terms of file size, they are so large that most of us don't use web fonts for body text. It's just too heavy. And the fallback is usually to system fonts, whatever the OS has installed. So for this particular presentation that you're seeing, I did not explicitly specify any Chinese font. So the browser is picking whatever font that the system prefers. I'm on a Mac. So now I'm guessing most of the audience doesn't read Chinese because I don't see you, I don't know who you are. But there are two variants of the Chinese script. There's simplified Chinese and then there's traditional Chinese. And now these two glyphs that I have on the screen right now might look exactly the same for most people, but they are very minute differences in the ways of how the strokes look. And then for some glyphs, they just look completely different, right? And so when I set the language to traditional Chinese, in the right side example, the browser knows to pick the traditional Chinese typeface instead of the simplified typeface, which is what you see on the left. So there's one particular font variant property for East Asian text which allows us to control this glyph substitution and positioning. Han characters are not only used in Chinese. Japanese and Korean do have such characters show up from time to time as well. And so depending on the language or the writing script, the same character will not necessarily use the same glyph. So here I've set it to traditional, but if I just... Browser default is, I think, simplified, so I've just misspelled it, it's going to go to simplified. So you can kind of see a change happening on the screen, and what I previously said, that there are some glyphs that just look completely different. And that's what I mean, and this is the property that lets us tweak things around. Now the user agent will refer to the lang attribute when rendering text, but if the selected font lacks support for that language, we can ask the browser to use the typographic conventions of a related language present in the font instead. So this is some markup for Macedonian text. Now imagine that the font being used does not support Macedonian, but it does have characters for Serbian. Now, we don't want to mislead the browser by telling it's the wrong language, but the Serbian glyphs are relevant in this case. So you want to use Serbian glyphs, but still let the browser know that it's Macedonian language. So if we set the font language override property to SRB, the Macedonian text will use Serbian typographic conventions, so it looks alright, but it will be recognized by the browser as Macedonian content. So that's pretty cool. This one's more common. Like most of us would have used or encountered text transform throughout our jobs writing CSS, and I mean it's used for case adjustments and capitalization. But if you look really closely, especially for languages that are not English, you'll see, specific case mapping rules. For example, in German, right, the SZ becomes a double S when you set this to uppercase, right? So that's pretty nice. And the Greek vowels, they kind of, lose their accent when the entire word is uppercase, just stuff like that. For the Japanese language, there is kana, which is used usually for Ruby, which is, how do we explain this? It's like supplementary explanations of how to pronounce a word. And so if we can actually use CSS to tweak the presentation of these glyphs. This full-size kana unfortunately only works for Firefox as far as I know, but someone can try out my slides on Chrome and let me know if they support that now. And then we come on to line breaks. So we've moved up from the glyph level to a line level. This example is to lay the groundwork for something else I want to cover, so I just want everyone to be patient with me. This is just to show that and remind everyone that everything on the web is boxes. So in this year example, we have actually a total of 5 inline boxes because I have my P element with, no tag, and then M tag, and then strong tag, and then more anonymous boxes. But there are 5 of them, trust me. So right now, at this size, there's enough room for all of them to fit into one single line box. But let's say I bump the size up, and now there's not enough room. The inline boxes will be broken across line boxes. There are three line boxes now, and the break here, like at generates or at really, these are line breaks. Now, if content wrapping is enabled, which is the default, the user agent has to minimize the amount of content overflowing a line by wrapping the line at a soft wrap opportunity. For English, the soft wrap opportunity is at a word boundary, where spaces or punctuation are used explicitly to separate words. But see, line breaking, there's a lot of nuance when different languages are involved, because different languages have different line breaking rules. So for example, English wraps its spaces. But then if you have a language like Japanese or Chinese, the break is per character until the few occasions where it's not. Because there's also specific Chinese or Japanese prohibition rules for punctuation marks, whereby you can't break at the punctuation. It's a bit complicated. There are also scripts like Thai, which are written without spaces between words. If you've ever seen like Thai text before, it's like a whole, there's no spaces anywhere. But then the text ends up being wrapped at syllable boundaries in addition to word boundaries. So if you don't read Thai, sad for you, you're not going to know where the line break's happening. And we could keep going on here just because there's so many different writing scripts in the world, right? So these are the 4 properties here for controlling line breaks. However, there's also interplay with the white space property. And if you're a math person, the number of permutations and combinations makes it pretty, I would say, powerful, but also sometimes a little confusing, because with a lot of precise control, you have a lot of cases. So there are some rules that take precedence over others if both are present. For example, if white space allows wrapping, or if they do not. There's this fascinating talk all about line breaking by Florian Rivoal at .css a couple of years back. So if you're interested in diving into the weeds, I suggest watching that one. Now, in addition to line breaks, we can actually just break the word, right? If you don't use lang property, though, a lot of out-of-the-box features like automatic hyphenation you do not get. Why? Because when the lang attribute is set correctly, the browser knows what the language is, the browser knows how to spell things, and the browser knows how to hyphenate words. So to err on the side of caution, if you don't declare the lang attribute, the browser's like, I don't know what language this is, I'm not going to misspell anything, and I'm not going to break any words, because incorrect hyphenation makes the text very bad to read. So the default out-the-box value of hyphens is manual. So you can see in my example here, I just on purpose chose really long words that I can't read myself. But if I set this to, let me think, I think it's auto, because each of these words have been correctly tagged with their language, auto just hyphenates where we need to. So I find this pretty good, because the manual route is to ask, content authors to use this like ampersand shy. But are you really going to insert that into words manually? I really don't think so. So browser support for hyphenations is pretty reasonable, but I think Chrome seems to hyphenate slightly differently. So again, always test before doing things. Writing mode is also something that is controlled by CSS. So for flipping text to vertical, you can use the writing mode property. And then there's right to left and left to right, because depending on the script, for example, left to right, that's relevant for Mongolian, right to left, that's relevant for the East Asian scripts like Chinese and Japanese. Text orientation is used in combination with vertical writing, because if you vertically typeset East Asian text and you intersperse it with Latin words or characters, there is an opportunity for abbreviations of kind of flipping them upright if they're narrow enough. So for example, if it's just 3 characters like NBA, you can kind of like squish them. into the space of one character. So these are really specific language-related CSS. Now, what about languages like Hebrew or Arabic, which are right to left though? Writing mode does not cover those. In fact, CSS should not be used for bidirectional styling. And those of you who happen to work in right to left languages and somehow have an interplay with like the East Asian languages that get typeset vertically, I believe you would find quite a number of bugs simply because that combination is not tested enough. But the long and short of it is the Unicode bidirectional algorithm handles the display ordering of bidirectional text. So for those of you who are interested, that is the Unicode standard ANX number 9. It's a pretty fascinating read. But the guidance is that because styling applied via CSS has the possibility of being turned off, being overridden, being unrecognized, or however, the recommended approach for right to left text is to use the direction, dir, direction attribute to set the base direction of the text for display, because that's part of the HTML, and the odds that that goes wrong is just much, much lower. Now, in spite of the fact that vertical writing is only relevant to East Asian text, that does not mean that vertical text involves only content in those languages. Because vertical text has been used in graphic design for a long time across many different cultures. And the fact that we can now do this on the web without too much trouble, I think is a great plus from a design perspective. For example, this 1927 posters published by Gazizdat, I'm pronouncing it wrong. You can recreate a print design like this in HTML and CSS today. So I think that's really cool. Now, we've come to the part where physical directions become confusing when the writing modes go all over the place. For example, this one, vertical text usually gets confusing for me when I have to adjust like margins and paddings, because for the most part we tend to refer to the physical directions of top, bottom, left, right. And this mental model, on a person, like some of you might be good at this, but for me I'm not. This mental model is hard for me to maintain when the text is in another writing direction. So for example, if like I switch this to, I'm gonna say vertical, I can't spell vertical RL, for example, and I'm like, it's kissing the edge. I wanna give it some room. So I'm gonna set like margin bottom, like 1em, and like it does nothing. It does nothing because it's not margin bottom that the browser is looking for. It's actually margin left, and I'm like, no, I cannot wrap my head around it. And this is where logical properties are really helpful. And personally, I've already migrated my mental model to start using the margin start, block start, block end, inline start, inline end, because if I wanted a margin at the start of the word, I would go inline start 1em, and somehow it's just so much easier for my brain to reason this versus physical directions, because I think things relative to the direction of the text, even though some other people might not. You know, it's a whole thing. But basically, this is the mapping for positioning. But like I mentioned, I've already stopped writing physical directions on my CSS since logical properties have achieved baseline status. And if you've never heard of baseline, do check out the Interop project, which essentially is a cross-browser initiative that helps inform developers like you and I whether a property is interoperable across major browsers or not. It's also integrated into Can I Use, so you would see like an icon for baseline nowadays if you check it. This is not, okay. So there are also corresponding mappings for margin, paddings, and borders. So for this particular example, if you see with different physical directions, if I wanted styles that corresponded to the writing direction of my text, I would have had to write different styles for each of the 6 writing directions. But with logical properties, one time write the same thing, and no matter how your text, whatever direction it is, don't have to rewrite anything. So I love that. And there's also mappings for sizing. So instead of width and height, you can use block size and inline size. I think support for that is not as good yet, but something to keep in mind. And then one last thing I want to cover, I'm probably going to be over time soon. Another thing CSS can do on the internationalization front has to do with lists and counters. Now, numeral systems are, writing systems for expressing numbers. And even though the most commonly used system of numerals is the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, 0, 1, 2, 3, CSS allows us to display ordered lists with other numeral systems as well. For example, this is standard, upper Roman, but I think I like cool things like CJK earthly branch. I mean, it's a Chinese thing, but I love that they translated it into earthly branch, and there's also heavenly stem. Yes, I'm very happy that this actually made it into a specification and into CSS. Predefined counter styles can be used with the list style type property, and this covers 174 numeral systems from Afar to Urdu. So there's very varying degrees of browser support. So do check out MDN if you ever want to use any of these in your non-English language sites. This one, absolutely nothing to do with internationalization. I just feel that CSS counters are cool and FizzBuzz is possible. That is all. So I'm personally still trying to learn more about internationalization best practices and how CSS, especially the newer techniques, can help us build better experiences for users all around the world, not just English speakers. So these are some resources for those of you who want to learn more, and also feel free to reach out to me. I would love to chat more about this topic, CSS, web development in general. And I did not introduce myself, but my name is Jing, and these emojis describe who I am, and yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Who would have thought FizzBuzz with CSS? It turns out that CSS is a programming language after all. Really cool. Unfortunately, Jing hasn't landed yet, I think. So that's fine. I think we can maybe have a little chat here. If anyone has any questions or wants to share any thoughts around this talk, feel free to do that, or raise your hand if you want to give any of your comments to the group. And I see Robert's hand is up.
So my question is if there's anyone who can help with a specific language or who has experience with testing a specific language. I'm really looking forward to talking to you because we did do some optimizations. We tested like in Arabic. We have some tweaks in the Utrecht design system to use the ordered list, the specific numbering, and we do have some tweaks for line breaks for some languages. We would love to be able to extend it to support more languages and more translations. So even if you use Google Translate, you get the best experience in many languages. So please reach out if you can help with testing because you know some language well.